Hello everyone, and welcome to today's session on searching for qualitative evidence as part of this day with the Cochrane Information Retrieval Methods Group. My name is Dr. Andrew Booth, and I'm very pleased to be able to present this information on behalf of the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group. When we're talking about guidance for the qualitative evidence for searching for it, then we're actually talking about three related sets of documents. On the left-hand side here, we have the primary source, chapter 21 of the Cochrane Handbook on qualitative evidence, and that covers the whole review process, and within that there is a section that I will highlight specifically on the search process. But we felt a need to go into more detail than that, and so we published supplementary guidance in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. And paper 2 contains the information on methods for question formulation, searching, and protocol development. So there is more search detail here. But also, I would refer you to paper 4, specifically on searching for process evaluations, and paper 6, which relates to reporting your search strategy. But as Carol said, we had encouragement to highlight the evidence base behind the recommendations that we made. And so a third source is the Searching for Qualitative Research for Inclusion in Systematic Reviews methodological review published in the journal Systematic Reviews, and that presented the evidence for searching for qualitative research using the 7S framework, and I'm going to use that to present the guidance today. So the specific section of the Cochrane Handbook looking at searching for qualitative evidence is section 21.7 within chapter 21, and here's the full list of authors of the whole chapter. So a little bit of context. It's true to say that procedures for retrieval of qualitative research are relatively underdeveloped compared with the amazing work done by the Information Retrieval Methods Group more generally within quantitative research. And there are particular challenges in trying to retrieve qualitative research, and these are well documented. The use of non-informative titles and abstracts, the diffuse terminology to refer to different types of qualitative research, the poor indexing and indeed lack of breadth of indexing in some of the major databases, and an overwhelming prevalence of quantitative studies within the data sources. It's been estimated that only 1% of Medline, for example, are qualitative studies. And the guidance recommends that when planning a search, we should consider the 7S framework. So these respectively are sampling, sources, structured questions, search procedures, strategies and filters, supplementary strategies, and standards for reporting. So going through these in turn, so we do address the issue of sampling. Many of you will be familiar with the default for quantitative searching, which is the comprehensive, sometimes called exhaustive approach. But within qualitative research, although this is also prevalent, an alternative method involves purposive sampling. The reason for that being that some reviews are more interpretive, and so a purposive sampling is more sensitive to the qualitative paradigm. So, for example, you could perhaps have maximum variation sampling where you're looking at very different cases, or intensity sampling where you're looking at very rich cases. In terms of sources, well, obviously, journal articles remain the primary source, and so guidance that's present in the main handbook chapter is also appropriate. But qualitative evidence is more likely to be found in such things as book chapters, theses, and grey literature reports. And so a search strategy for qualitative evidence should place extra emphasis on these particular sources. Having said that, the coverage of studies included in qualitative synthesis is in the regions of around about 90% you'll see figures for different searches involving syntheses that search 2 databases, 89%, 3 databases, 92%, 4 databases, 93%. But the point there is that the remainder will usually be found in these alternative sources, and of course it can add valuable and often unique insights. So just because it reaches such a high coverage isn't a reason for not directing efforts towards these supplementary sources. And also in terms of sources, local databases can be particularly valuable given that we know that context is really important when conducting qualitative research. In terms of the third S, structured questions, there are a number of formulations to choose from. SPICE has been around for quite some time. SPIDER also is appropriate for mixed method studies, and the recent addition is Perspective, which was developed for the WHO use of qualitative evidence syntheses. In terms of search procedures, Julie's already talked about the importance of locating associated or sibling reports, and this is particularly the case for qualitative evidence. You can get added value from qualitative evidence that accompanies a randomized controlled trial because of their shared context, but also following a trail around major studies can be very important. And so the cluster acronym focuses on 6 of those supplementary routes to identify these associated or sibling reports. And then there's the 7th element, which involves pursuing any theories that are present in your index study. In relation specifically to searching for theory, and this can be particularly important both in organizing your qualitative synthesis and in interpreting it, a basic strategy which can be run on bibliographic databases or on Google Scholar would involve truncations of model, theory, concept, and framework. On to the next S, strategies and filters. The search filters for qualitative studies, again, are less well developed. But they lack the specificity of quantitative counterparts that have been developed over many years. These filters may facilitate picking out the qualitative studies from a mass of quantitative studies, or indeed retrieving mixed methods studies with qualitative data in it. But also bear in mind that there are alternate filters that look for a particular phenomenon, like, for example, the sign filters for patient preferences. And so, as I mentioned, this is particularly useful when the qualitative literature is being swamped by an overwhelming quantitative literature. Supplementary strategies, poor indexing of qualitative studies mentioned earlier makes 2 particular supplementary strategies important in the context of qualitative evidence. Citation searching, the standard backward checking of references, but also the forward citation searching of Google Scholar or Web of Science. And related articles features can also help tackle the diffuseness of terminology. And the evidence for this is relatively thin and relatively recent, but an example of this is where supplementary strategies such as these identified 5 qualitative studies that wouldn't have been picked up through the more traditional routes. And 3 of these studies were of good quality and 1 moderate quality. But more importantly, those 4 included qualitative studies made significant contributions to the synthesis. So certainly attention to supplementary strategies is worthwhile in terms of a better review. Reporting standards, well, I would refer you to the information on reporting standards in the the principal chapter that Carol highlighted, but in addition to that, some considerations are the recommendation in our chapter to use a structured approach to reporting. We propose for the moment the Starlight way of reporting, because it contains the elements, including the ones I've already mentioned, which are the sampling strategy. So, for example, whether comprehensive or purposive, and that would also pick up whether the search had been iterative or conducted in a single stage. So although that Starlight hasn't been developed in a consensual way, as is now recommended, it still has some use within the types of syntheses produced by our group. In terms of reporting in other standards, NTREC is very similar to PRISMA. It's patterned on it, and there are 4 particular elements that relate to searching. You'll see element 3 does include these elements of comprehensive searching and iterative searching as well. The inclusion criteria again look very similar to the Starlight criteria highlighted just previously. There's the variety of data sources that I mentioned, and of course the equal requirement, as with the quantitative studies, to report a search strategy, or ideally multiple search strategies in full. The chapter first for us is to try and move into the more experimental area of process evaluations, reflecting the change of name of our group since the last handbook. And for the moment, these experimental approaches to find process evaluations, which are the sort of sibling studies that Julie referred to earlier, are to identify those studies at the point of selection, so it's part of the selection process rather than searching, to restrict process evaluations to those that are linked to RCTs. So when you retrieve an RCT, the process evaluation will be retrieved if the trial is an important part of it. To use unevaluated filter terms. Again, these are just suggested terms: process evaluation, program evaluation, feasibility study, etc. And to use citation-based approaches, which we've already said are important in the context of qualitative and implementation research. And we expand on that in our supplementary guidance article in Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. So that concludes a fairly rapid tour through the qualitative and implementation methods guidance. A supplementary function of this particular presentation is to update the evidence base, which was highlighted from that article in 2016, and so I've tended to feature some of the articles in our area that have appeared since then, and they will be available with my slides. And just to say that for those of you who want to refer to this presentation separately, it will be available on YouTube straight after this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We do have one question that's come through. Imelda asks, since I do not have access to Embase, I was curious as to whether they have qualitative filters.
They do have qualitative filters. Yes, they were developed as part of the McMaster's Hedges project of a few years ago. I mean, obviously, that project is now quite dated. But they have been returned to more recently in the literature, and always the source promoting another activity that Julie and certainly Carol were instrumental in setting up. The ISSG filters site is one way of finding out the availability of filters, and we are committed to regular or annual updates of that. So if there are more recent filters, that they will feature in that resource, and there is a specific chapter of that search filters site on the qualitative filters. Thank you for that question.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew. I think what we can do is we'll move on to, oh, we had one more just come through. So another question, when using a hedge, is it important to find a validated one as opposed to developing your own? As many times I find there are missing phrases in hedges, I have found.
Yes, I think that's again a very good question. I did emphasise that there's a lot more experimentation going on in qualitative than in quantitative, and we've certainly not had anything like the retrospective indexing of qualitative, of randomised controlled trials. Nothing comparable in the qualitative domain, and unlikely ever to be honest. What there is some evidence for, and it's very tentative and it's in a number of case studies, is that there is a sort of a tailing off, a law of diminishing returns, so that some very key qualitative terms like qualitative findings and interviews pick up a great proportion of the qualitative studies, and after that the others become much more speculative. So although supplementing an existing hedge with terms that you see as obvious omissions may be of benefit, you have to consider that it could be an awful lot of effort to identify things that either only retrieve a very small proportion of additional possible studies, or in fact just provide another way of retrieving what you already have. So you have to think of the time it will take against that possible benefit.
Excellent. And our next question is from Rosa, who asks, just wondering if Covidence works for screening of qualitative research, or what is the best software?
Yeah, we've got to be careful we don't come into a sort of sales promotion thing, but like Julie, I am a great fan of using the Covidence tool, and we use it for our qualitative syntheses, and of course it's used prominently within Cochrane. There are no technical requirements different from screening qualitative evidence. Obviously what you're looking for and how you spot it are different, but the actual process is not software dependent. So if something works well for you on your quantitative studies, then the same software will work equally for your qualitative studies.
Excellent. And another question that's come through, is there a minimum number of qualitative studies necessary when deciding whether a systematic review of qualitative studies can be done?
A lovely question, one that we agonise over quite a lot. It depends what you're trying to do. In the context of Cochrane, of course, we want to provide answers, not just contribute to academic knowledge. So even the existence of a small number of studies could well provide valuable insights. In the context of student assignments, we say that if you have somewhere between 6 and a dozen, then that sort of optimizes the balance between the richness of what you have to work with and the feasibility of doing the review. But we certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to start with the number and work backwards. And then just the sort of final point about that is that there are some journals who are suspicious of qualitative findings that are only supported by one study. But if that's all there is, all that have been found, then that's the reality. So that tends to be a sort of an editorial preference rather than a hard rule. So I hope that gives a little bit of a feel for some of the issues that we're continually struggling with.